Richard was born and raised in great part in Trinidad. His education is largely in England. He went to Keele University as an undergraduate, what we would call an undergraduate, and his graduate work was at the University of Manchester. He was trained in deeply solid, serious kind of British training in social and political history, and it still shows in his book. He also became a damn good cricket player and a footballer, and when riding the train through England at one point, he would point out, yeah, I played in that stadium, I played in that stadium, I played in that stadium. But, you know, if you can't make it in cricket or baseball, you become a historian. There are many books. I'm just going to mention them, say something about the new book, and then we'll get at it. In the 1980s, if you were to read something about black abolitionists, you would first start with Benjamin Quarles, the great African-American historian who taught all of his life at Morgan State University. He wrote a book called Black Abolitionist in the 70s. And then you read Blackett, because in the 80s, Richard Blackett began to write about black abolitionists like no one ever had. In 1983, he published a book called Building an Anti-Slavery Wall, Black Americans in the Atlantic Anti-Slavery World. And Richard, frankly, was doing a kind of Atlantic history before so many of us would call it that. He even had it in his titles before people would call it that. Then he published Beating Against the Barriers, biographical essays in 19th century Afro-American history. Having Afro-American in a title kind of dates people, yep. But that's all right. But those were biographical essays about, to that point, very little known black abolitionists. And thank God he left James McCune Smith out so I could do that one. But you almost did James McCune Smith as well. And those are still tremendous books. I mean, if you want to know anything about black abolitionists, that's where you start. Then he published the book Thomas Morris Chester, Black Civil War Correspondent, Dispatches from the Virginia Front. This was a black newspaper columnist, correspondent, war correspondent during the Civil War, who frankly most of us knew nothing about. And Richard went and found all of his writings. And in fact, the book includes most of those dispatches. That was a pioneering work. Who knew there were black war correspondents in the Civil War? Then what, until the Fugitive Slave book, was his greatest book, I thought, Divided Hearts, which he published in 2001, which is Britain and the American Civil War. It is the best thing ever written on the internal struggle within Great Britain over the American Civil War, the way the Brits divided over our Civil War. Deeply researched in the British archives, as in some ways only Richard could have done. Then he's also published Making Freedom, The Underground Railroad and the Politics of Slavery, which I think was a lecture series. That just came out about 4 or 5 years ago, which was during the process of him doing his fugitive slave work. And then just this past summer, he published The Captive's Quest for Freedom, Fugitive Slaves, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, and the Politics of Slavery. I want to say just one other quick thing. For graduate students who are present, or for that matter, anybody, Richard is a quintessential example of a research historian who just never leaves the archives. His work is so deeply researched that sometimes, I mean, the footnotes in Richard's work are take no prisoner footnotes. And the latest book is a classic example of this. He is an empirical historian, although I'm going to ask you this question later and get you to reflect on it a bit, who no doubt begins with a thesis. We all walk around with theses in our head and arguments we think we're going to find. But he builds what he writes from the archives. He keeps that horse ahead of the cart, as it were, and how we do this work, how we do history, as well as anyone I've ever known. So, with that, I could go on and tell you more stories, but that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about The Captive's Quest for Freedom. which is a study, a deep study, of the Fugitive Slave Act as a great pivot in American history, a huge turning point in the slavery story, the slavery crisis, and in American political history. But it's then mostly a study of the fugitive slaves themselves, their lives, their communities, their struggles, their crises, abolitionists who became involved with them, helped them, worked with them in complicated ways, sometimes secret, but often not secret at all. And it is very much about the conservative, sometimes you're calling it unionist, pro-compromise efforts to sustain a legal regime to return human beings as property, slaves as property. So it's about the fugitive slave crisis from both angles of the fugitive slave experience and the resistance to the fugitive slave law, but also about the incredibly powerful movements to enforce that law and sustain that law right up until Fort Sumter. Okay, that's a quick survey.
Well, I could go home now.
No, you don't. Richard, how do you end up from where you had worked before on so many other subjects? What got you to this topic? Was it kind of a lot of new work on the Underground Railroad? Had you always kind of wanted to just hang out in 100 Midwestern archives to read newspapers? I mean, what got you to this topic and then this book?
That's a difficult question. Oh, thanks for inviting me.
I'm supposed
thanks
to
for all
ask
of you to come. People assume that I have great intellectual vision about things that I'm going to do, and I don't. My first book was written because I was married to an English woman who insisted that we go back to London every year. And I thought I should try and do something while I'm sitting in England every year at a summer. And that's how the research project started. There was nothing intellectual about it. I didn't have visions of transatlantic history and all that sort of stuff. But you
weren't a pioneer of a trend after all.
There's a story behind that. There's an explanation behind that. And it is that I start projects that sort of capture my fancy. I go and I start doing research on it, and then I start asking questions about the research, about what I have discovered. I never go into a project with a grand idea. I let the research tell me where to go. I let the narrative that I'm writing take me in places that I didn't anticipate going. Because for all of you folks in here who are, even those of you who are not just starting, I have a saying that I tell my graduate students, that a good historian is like a bad mechanic. When you finish fixing the car, there are lots of pieces on the ground that you know belong in the car, but you don't know where the hell to put them, so you just leave them on the ground. And that is how I have written history. I amass an incredible amount of information, and I start thinking about what it is I have, and that leads me to some sort of interpretive framework. I never go at a work with any sort of interpretive framework. But this, directly to your question...
It makes you very old-fashioned.
Yes. Yeah, proudly so. But this work came to me. I have always been intrigued by people who leave no records. And how do we understand what they have done with their lives in an oppressive situation? And I think fugitive slaves epitomize that. They have left fewer. Much as you will see when you get to read this book, is that lots of my interpretation of what was going on come out of failures to achieve what people wanted to achieve. In failing, I am able to come up with some idea about what it is they're thinking about. So that if there's a theory behind this book, and for those of you in the room who are not, who don't understand cricket, I will pity you, but let me just go ahead and explain. Most probably the best sociology of sport is a book written by C.L.R. James called Beyond the Boundary. And I was reading that book years ago, and he has a sentence in it. We get to know what people think by what they do. And I thought, that's fugitive slaves, as I started working on this project. Because they've left me no records, but I can understand what their conceptions of freedom by looking at what they do. So that if there's something that drives it, it's that idea. And the transatlantic thing that interests me also, as a non-American, is I was always, after spending a couple of years teaching in the United States, I was struck by the fact that people think that the United States is the center of the world. And I thought, that's very strange. And now, as a colonial, as a former colonial, I should never quote Kipling. Huh?
But I kind of twisted the Kipling-esque phrase to come up with a phrase that says, what do they know of America who only America knows? Mm-hmm. And that, to me, put America in that transatlantic, that broader world community that began to make sense, so that I could understand America more by looking at America outside of the United States and try and have a conversation. So that explains, besides my story about my wife, that explains that early thing. But the idea of trying to understand how people who left no records affected policy and the politics of the time in which they operated strike me as very, very critical in this period. And that becomes, in so many ways, the thread of this book. The way in which many anonymous fugitive slaves, although some we know well and some you've found and given names to, had so much to do with causing this great crisis and causing disunion and bringing about a conflict that, is in some ways, in the end, even blamed upon them. Okay. For the good of the whole of the audience, explain the Fugitive Slave Act.
Oh, God.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is your chance. On the back of the business card, it's written by James Mason in 1850. It's an update of the original clause in the U.S.
1893.
Yeah, but it comes out of a crisis. It becomes, in some ways, the most contested constitutional, legal problem of the entire 1850s. It never goes away. All kinds of efforts are made to both enforce it, get around it, resist it, defy it. What was it when it was passed?
Well, the first fugitive slave law was, as you may know, was 1793. And ever since 1793, proponents of slavery were upset that it didn't have the kind of impact that it should have had in terms of its enforcement. Then in 1842, there's a famous Supreme Court decision that said the law has to be obeyed, but states don't really have to effectively help the federal government to enforce the law.
At Prigg, right?
Yes, at Prigg. And so that lots of states said, oh, that's interesting. We won't do anything to help you. So by the time we get to the Mexican-American War, all of this stuff is bubbling, and a decision is, and this is being driven by slaveholders and slaveholding interests who want a more effective fugitive slave law. A law with teeth is the driving objective here. One that is enforceable, one that compels all forms of government as well as all citizens to enforce and to help to enforce that law. That is the objective. So the law is structured in such a way that it creates slaveholders of potential slaveholders of every citizen of the United States. So even if you are partial, or you're indifferent to slavery, and a slave catcher comes to your door, or a sheriff comes to your door and say, you have to help me catch these fugitive slaves, you are obligated to do it. The penalty is $1,000 for refusing. $1,000 in 1850 is a lot of money. There are also incentives built into the law that would ensure that the general population comes around to supporting the law, because there are some financial benefits involved in it. There are also incentives for people who are enforcing the law, and we could talk about this later, but there's a kind of quasi-judicial officer that is created called a commissioner, who has absolutely the last word.
In fact, you say that the meaning of the Fugitive Slave Act was whatever the commissioners decided on.
Yes. There's no appeal to the commissioner's decision. There are other horrendous parts of this law. It violates all basic traditional jurisprudence. There's no habeas corpus. There's no trial by jury. All you need, so the whole law and its enforcement mechanism turns on whether or not the person standing before the commissioner is identified as the same person who is described in the request, in the warrant for his or her arrest. And that warrant is issued at the place far removed from where the slave has actually, the accused slave has escaped. So the system, the law is most probably, I think, the most consequential, politically consequential law of the antebellum period. And by its very nature, it violates all the basic principles of Western jurisprudence. Rumpole of the Old Bailey would have been horrified by an idea that you could actually have a law in which there's no habeas corpus and there's no... Because for proponents of this law, it was a procedural hearing. It was never called a case, it was called a hearing. And it was procedural. So that if the commissioner decides that the evidence on the warrant fits the person who is in front of you, in front of him, then that person is remanded to the owner.
And Richard, I want you to say a little bit about this. I was struck so much reading your book. I mean, I've read a lot about this before, but I don't think I've dwelt on this enough. The language with which the Fugitive Slave Act is supported, argued, is all about law, rule of law, enforce the law. Southerners were saying, you must enforce the law. This is just rule of law. Now think about it. We are hearing a lot right now about rule of law, rule of law, rule of law. That was their argument, and it was beguiling, because what they're really saying is, our slaves are property. You're violating the Constitution by not helping us return them. And the burden was on, of course, the anti-slavery folk to make the argument in some legal way that, well, we're not enforcing the law, but the law is evil.
Morally indefensible.
Yeah, morally indefensible.
Yes, yes.
But on the other side, it's just enforce the law, please.
Yeah, but look, if you declare, as has always been declared, that you are a society of laws, yeah. If bad laws are violated by good men, bad men would violate good laws. I mean, it's a powerful argument on the part of the slave interests. So it's a hard. I mean, that's why when people tell me they're a society of laws, I just blanch, because it might be true, but
you know too much about the 19th century.
Yes, it might be true, but it contains so many traps that once you buy it, once you say yes, then until the law is changed, you have to obey the law, and you have to enforce the law.
Yeah.
Now, to whom do I appeal if I'm opposed to this system, or if I'm a slave? To whom do I appeal? Do I go to the courts? Do I go to the Supreme Court? Do I appeal to people's better nature? Where do I go? Do I openly violate the law? Do I say, hell no, it won't happen here? There are all kind of options, but the options in the broad sweep of things, none of them is good.
Can I use a quote you found from Jermaine Logan? This is one of those quotes when you find it, you say, God, I couldn't have made that up. Jermaine Logan was himself a former fugitive slave, upstate New York. His answer about, just enforce the law. I don't respect this law. I don't fear it. I won't obey it. It outlaws me. I outlaw it. And the men who attempt to enforce it, on me. I outlaw it because it outlaws me.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a simple logic in that, which is a bad law, you have a right to resist. On the other hand,
it is a law.
The right to resist might mean, you risk your life, and he did.
Yes.
And he had to go to Canada.
Yes.
Anyway, before we leave the law, though, please do discuss this business of the commissioners a little more. Because it always was the mystery in this law to me. How was this actually enforced? Where? How often? And ironically, the renditions, that is, a return of fugitive slaves, when you actually, and Richard has done his own data study here to come up with numbers on this. The sheer numbers are not that great who are sent back, and yet it is such a divisive political issue, even if there's only one or two that are actually sent back.
Yeah.
So the commissioners, and you talk about many of them as real people and real names and real places, and also the fact that it wasn't always a healthy job to be a fugitive slave commissioner in some communities.
No, the commissioner is a semi-judicial position that had been in existence since the turn of the century.
Yeah.
They kind of pushed papers and did sort of small fry, quasi-legal work. But they become the center of this law. The law and its enforcement mechanisms is structured to a large extent on this group called the commissioners. So for many of the proponents of the law, these are not magistrates. These are not judges. They're commissioners. The purpose of their job is simply to look at the evidence and render a verdict. That is what they're supposed to do. Now, there's an incentive built into the law for commissioners. If you return a fugitive, you get $10. If you don't, you get $5. It's for me, that is the capitalist moment in America. I'm sitting there thinking, well, And what is marvelous is that supporters of the law try to explain the differential. They really try to explain it. They say one involves, if you're going to send somebody back, it involves more paperwork. So the commissioners also were lawyers in most cases. They were invariably Democrats, their political affiliation. Under the law, they were named to this office by heads of local circuit courts. So it means that the circuit court judges who named these commissioners were usually naming people who were political affiliates or the children of political affiliates, but so that to a large extent the majority were Democrats. A commissioner had no particular remit. So if I'm a commissioner for New Haven and you come into Fairfield to recapture a slave, and I could come to the commissioner of New Haven because the slaveholders know, the slave catchers know that I'm partial to the law. And I could apply for an arrest warrant, and that applies to areas even outside my jurisdiction. So that in one instance here that I talk about, the commissioner from Harrisburg, people came from all over Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
This is McAllister.
Yeah, he's a piece of work. People come from all over.
Didn't he have a 100% record?
100% record.
You go to this guy,
Yes.
slaves are going back to the South.
But what happened, he worked so hard at enforcing this law that he became a pariah in his own community. So it's one of those great ironies of history. Even his vestry threw him out. So
And a lot of them get ostracized. They become persona non grata in communities. It's not
and then there were some commissioners. There are a few examples. There's one particular example of a guy in Philadelphia who he was a commissioner late in the game in the late 1890s.
Ingram?
Yeah, no, Ingram
That's
is
another one.
he has nothing good to say about Ingram. But this other commissioner, he's Quaker, and his family says, you got to do this job because if you don't do this job, some other person who is pro-slavery is going to do it. So we want you to do it, and we want to make sure that you do it the way you're supposed to do it. And there are reports that his wife was willing to withhold certain pleasures if he didn't do it. That's my interpretation of it. But don't Quaker wives have certain powers? Yes. But it was clear that he came to this thing from a completely different angle. But he only adjudicated one case. So it's clear that after that, he was no longer in favor.
So let's talk about the resistance, the defiance, the individual resistance. You've got many examples of that, but also collective resistance. There are famous rescue cases that, if you know your antebellum American history, you've heard of some of them. But in Richard's book, he found all sorts of other small-scale resistances or defiances by communities, by groups. Talk about that a bit. It's widespread.
Yes, yes.
It makes this law almost all but unenforceable in many places.
But people who were opposed to this law in Congress said, listen, this will happen.
Yeah.
They were told, but the proponents of the law either ignored them or thought that this would never happen in America. But they were warned that there would be resistance. There was threatened resistance before the law was enacted. They were told, look, it won't happen here. Particularly prominent black figures who said, there's that wonderful quote from Martin Delany that says, if a slave catcher comes to my house to take a fugitive slave and he leaves alive, then the heavens should reject my soul and my body. I mean, folks said it, not here. There were communities that local police authorities knew they could not go into because even though they had warrants for arrest, they knew where the person was, as in the case of William and Ellen Craft in Boston. The police, the authorities knew where they were, and the authorities are saying to the slave catchers, we shouldn't do this. I do this on peril of my own life. I can't go in there and do it. So there was that kind of resistance. There was open defiance as well, where in Harrisburg again, McAllister ruled in favor of the slaveholder, and because of the Pennsylvania law that say you couldn't hold a fugitive slave in a state prison, there were no federal prisons in those days. So McAllister was forced to put the slaveholder and the fugitive slave, put him up in a hotel, and the community burned the hotel down during the night. Now, they escaped, but it was a clear message. As part of the law, also, if the commissioner rules for a return and suspects, or the slaveholder or his agent suspects that the community will protest this, the commissioner has the authority to call out a posse of any size that he thinks. Payment for that posse comes out of the federal treasury.
That's right. The federal government is paying.
The federal government will pay for a posse of whatever size. And if you look at these letters and reports of people who are sending in their expense accounts, it is per diem, it is jail fees, it's food, it's rail travel, whatever it is. It's done by miles, distance. But what is curious about the law, and it taught me something about laws and how they operate, and why most probably I feel so happy I didn't become a lawyer. I told one of my children it was the second oldest profession, and it was less honorable than the first. But these they didn't know they didn't know how to effect the law, how to put it into operation. So the first 18 months of this law, people are fumbling about, how do we pay? Who do we pay? Where does this money come from? So you read all these Treasury reports, and they're totally unclear about how you do this, and they're simply fumbling around. And that's when I realized that, the third world ain't so bad. Because I thought that was the kind of stuff that we used to do in Trinidad. And here I am reading United States history, and the damn people don't even know how to do it. And you say, what?
So let's talk about some real people, just at least briefly, who were rescued here. There's some famous rescues. I mean, just to throw Douglass in, I mean, some of you know these famous quotes from Douglass, where he said, the way to make the fugitive slave law a dead letter is to create a few dead slaveholders. Or dead slave catchers, excuse me. And the reason a slave catcher fears having his throat cut is because he deserves to have it cut. This law, though, radicalized a lot of people, black and white, in northern communities. It turned some, right? I mean, it turned some northern communities into a certain kind of social chaos. You don't really employ, I don't think you employed the word revolutionary circumstances, but there were communities now when if there was an attempted rendition of a fugitive slave, there will be a mob.
In a minute.
In a minute.
In a minute.
Overnight, middle of the night, burning down a house, tearing people out of a jail cell, if they could.
Yes, yes. And women were incredibly involved in this.
Oh, that case, tell that case.
It's lots of women involved in all of this stuff. I mean, particularly in the Philadelphia hearings. The white abolitionist women sat around the perimeter of the hearing room. And the hearing rooms, let me just add, were always 2 by 5. I mean, I exaggerate. They're a little space. And the reason for it being a little space is that it keeps the community out. They're wonderful, stories of lawyers who are taking notes on the top of their hats because there are no facilities for them. And by the way, there's no legal representation for a fugitive slave under this law. So the women would sit around, the white women would sit around the periphery, particularly Lucretia Mott was at every single hearing. The black women would be outside, waiting for news to break, so that they could either storm the hearing or make sure that the policemen outside are incapable of moving the person out. And because the law's implementation turns on the identity of the person in front of the commissioner, it means identity becomes absolutely critical. And in America, where in many instances you can't tell one black person from the next black person, there is a lot of confusion going on here. Particularly if the person is phenotypically white. The commissioner is completely befuddled. Yeah. The people in the room are befuddled. There's one...
Is that the John Bolding case?
Bolding is
Tell about that one.
They brought in all...
They couldn't figure out... They spent enormous energy trying to figure out his race.
Yes. He ended up being part...
incredible American story. It's
Indian and part Negro. And they brought in all the experts. They brought in phrenologists who played with the guy's head to make sure that the bumps were all in the right place.
And one of the doctors held two skulls?
Yes, he held skulls in his hand and said,
this is an Indian skull and this is a
Negro skull. And look at the man's head. Look at Bolden's head over there. So he must be...
and he was returned to slavery?
He was returned, but then the community bought him.
Oh, that's right, that's right. Well, that's
the community, this is another thing that they did when they couldn't stop the law. People raised money to buy freedom, the freedom of the slaves. Of course, for many abolitionists, this is a violation of a basic principle. You're paying the slaveholder for somebody who is already free. But on the other hand, you can't push that too much, because most probably the guys who are making the point about not paying the slaveholder just put sugar in their coffee in the morning.
That's right.
And where is sugar grown by? I mean, so abolitionists are pulling their hair out here. There's people who fight oppression find themselves in many instances caught on the horns of a dilemma that is based on purity. You know, if I'm opposed to slavery, can I wear clothes made out of cotton? The slaveholders say, well, you're a hell of an abolitionist. All of that cotton is produced. I produce all that cotton through slave labor. The sugar you put in your tea is so that then abolitionists and others find themselves in a quandary about whether or not they should be using sugar. And then they go to free produce. They created these free produce stores where sugar by free labor is imported. But the damn thing is expensive because, you know, cheap slave labor is cheap. This is the cheapest form of labor.
Douglas's answer when he got attacked for allowing the Richardson sisters and his British friends to buy his freedom was, thank you very much, I'll take the freedom. Anyway,
he wasn't the only one.
No, not at all. If you would, just for a moment, there were so many of these interesting, famous rescues. Some succeed, some don't. But they're all violent. The Christiana case, which is sometimes called the Christiana Riot. Christiana is in southern Pennsylvania, Virginia, or
Maryland.
Maryland, slave owner comes after 4 or 5 of his slaves. Pitched battle occurs. He's killed. But and it's actually fascinating. The man named Parker, who led the defense of the fugitive slaves.
It sounds like the Black Panthers for those of you who they were defense teams.
Yeah, they were a defense team, and some of them had guns, some of them didn't. But they escaped from there actually, and knowing somehow that if they could get to Rochester and Frederick Douglass's house, that he probably would help.
But Parker knew Douglass
as a kid. He knew Douglass. He'd heard him speak and so on. But within 48 hours, they were in Douglass's house all the way out in Rochester, New York. It's such a story too. Douglass takes him in a carriage up to Lake Erie and sends him across the lake up to Toronto. And when Parker said goodbye to Douglass, he gave Douglass his revolver, which Douglas's family kept forever as a memento. But the really interesting thing about that in the end is like 30-some people are arrested, right?
It's the largest treason trial in America history. These people were not involved. These people were onlookers. Because when...
But they were all accused of treason.
When Gorsuch, and that's the name of the slaveholder, I am not joking. When Gorsuch appears in Christiana, the guys who knew he were coming because he had to go to Philadelphia to get a warrant. And once the black community, the black spy network in Philadelphia got word that he was doing, so they sent one of their men to warn the guys way over in Christiana that Gorsuch is coming. So they were prepared for him. They knew he was coming. And once he arrived, they blew the conch to warn. And
it was an ambush.
And the community, or the farming community, and that's the majority of them are white, come to witness. They don't come to be involved. They come to be witnesses to what is going on. And those people are brought up for treason. It's a trial that lasted a long time. Lots of money was spent on it, and it was a total bust. Nobody was found guilty. You can't. The basic response was you can't be charged for treason by just looking. But what the local authorities were arguing is that these guys had organized anti-slavery meetings before. They had published anti-slavery pamphlets. They were warning the community about slavery, so that they must have been involved in all of this in the broader sense. They created the atmosphere out of which this crisis arose.
And this is 1851. It's like a year after the passage of the Compromise, but it's at a very volatile political moment. There were Southern politicians here who basically were putting abolition on trial.
Not just
they're putting anti-slavery on trial.
Daniel Webster was putting abolitionists on trial. He said to the people in Syracuse, he says, I will come and take a fugitive slave from the city in the middle of an abolitionist meeting. Yeah. He said that to them. Yeah. And the folks say, Daniel, are you being stupid?
Well, in Massachusetts, they thought that. Let's talk, good transition. Let's talk about the politics of this. Mm-hmm. Anywhere from Clay and Webster, who wrote the Compromise of 1850, to, and I want to get you all the way to 1861 and the politics of this. This finds its way to the heart, if it wasn't always at the heart, of national politics. And you get a Henry Clay, the author, the great compromise, the author of the Compromise of 1850, not only making big pleas nationally for the enforcement of this law, but also now revving up again. I want you to talk about this. The question of colonization. In order to make this pill a little sweeter, the enforcement of this law, which is so unpopular in the North, and make no mistake, this is unpopular in not with all white Northerners. There's a huge political divide over this, but thousands, if not millions, of white Northerners hated this law because this now made them kind of complicit in this hideous system. But now you want to make this sweeter. You revive the old canard of colonization.
No.
We're gonna.
Douglas has a wonderful quote on that.
Oh, I know.
He says the fugitive slave law was meant to get slaves to return fugitives, and the colonizationists, on their end, want to get rid of all the free blacks.
Yeah. Removal.
So in the end, what you would have would be a society in which half is slave and half is free, and there'd be no such thing as a free black.
Right.
So he sees that as a wider, and I think he's absolutely correct about that. And I think what I try to do here is trace the revival of colonization. Right. Let me say colonization has been part and parcel of American political calculations going back to the founding. Right. And the whole idea of emancipation and removal, they go together. It is part and parcel of the idea about emancipation. So for many who are proponents of colonization, you cannot have in a racist society, as they admit, you cannot have this thing called a free black population. These people have to find a way to live separate. So that is one political feature, and we could come back to it. But I think one of the points that I try to make is that you have to look at these political issues on a number of levels. And you have to look at it from the point at which slaves decide to leave. You create a political crisis locally, particularly when there were group escapes. And increasingly in the 1850s, they're group escapes. They're called, in local newspapers, stampedes. And you have a wonderful idea of people, hundreds of people, but it's not. It's handfuls of people, which means that you're talking about efforts on the part of those who are going to escape to organize and plan for that escape. So that when a group of 8 or 10 people leave southwest Missouri and flee into Illinois, there's a crisis that is created locally, that ripples outwards to what is happening in Jefferson City, which is the capital of Missouri. It ripples outward also into Illinois, where the people are going, those who are protecting them, as well as the slaveholders and the slave catchers who have a pretty firm idea where the runaways are going, and therefore they go there, and
they have a
have
perfect
that,
right to go after
right,
them,
and you have a
legally.
clash in Illinois, and then you have the larger political. As these things multiply, you then have the issue that is being raised in Washington, D.C. about this law being deliberately subverted.
I'm really saying so many great things about your book. I don't want to overdo it.
But go ahead.
This is one of the... This part
You said that and it thundered. Did you hear that? Oh, man, that's dramatic effect.
Coming to get me. No. But it is part of the genius of your book that you can take a very local story about someone we've never heard of and show these ripple effects. And I would like you to say something now about the research here, because...
As I spoke again.
It's the ghost of
yes, whoever.
John C. Calhoun. Anyway, no.
Yes.
No, seriously. Richard went to so many archives, read so many local newspapers, and newspapers that are not digitized, folks. You cannot sit in your home study and find these newspapers. Talk about that, because you look at a Richard Black of Footnote, you're going to find the Ashtabula something or other and the Jefferson City something or other. I mean, there are towns you wouldn't even know would have newspapers, and they probably had 2 of them in those years. But this is so richly based upon newspapers, because a fugitive slave escape was news, wherever it happened. Yes. A runaway, yes. Not just a runaway ad now, but a story about it. And then when there's a capture, it's always news. So this story is there, more so than we ever really... You know, there was always this sort of assumption that, that we'll never really be able to know that much about who escaped and when and how many. The numbers have always been elusive. The Underground Railroad has always been this half-mythical thing anyway. It's amazing how much of this is actually recorded in newspapers. So talk about that newspaper research and and a little more about that local politics becoming ripple effects into national politics.
Yeah, a couple of years ago.
The cool weather's coming after this.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
I need to go back to Nashville, and I don't need any cool weather. A couple of years ago, the library, we got a new director at the library. And she was touring her plantations, visiting little...
At Vanderbilt?
Yes. Visiting each department, asking what modern technology she want, and in my usual fashion, halfway through I raised my hand and I said, "Excuse me, don't touch my old microfilm reader, please." You see that one that's on the 4th floor downstairs in the corner with the crank handle and a hole so that I could put my head in? Do not touch it, because I will sit outside your door and make a scene. Look, I found little going through. I'll find 3-4 words about. Let me give you an example. And by the way, the only way you can tell what the oppressed do is those who have left no records is by telling stories about them. So I deliberately, an event, I try to find the individuals, I try to name the individuals, I try to track them down, on both sides of the debate, and try to tell a story of it, because inherent in that story is some insight into the politics of these events. So I get a little... It must have been in an the Liberator or something like that, the abolitionist newspaper. It says, yesterday, and it gave the name of the 2 white individuals, were picked up in Boonville, Missouri. I'm sure there are people in here from Missouri, so I won't say anything about Boonville. And where? I said? It said Boonville, Missouri. So by chance, I go to the little lady who sits in the basement of the library who finds me any interlibrary loan. I just lob something at her and poof, it comes up. And there's a Boonville newspaper. So I go to the Boonville newspaper, and for pages and pages, there's an account of this escape.
Well, you have a lot of those examples.
It was a woman and her husband, and she seemed to be the driving force behind this. She dressed the two guys as Indians. And she was going to take them to the Indian Nation in Kansas. No, it failed. But inherent in that failure is a story. I then find out that that they were sentenced to long prison terms in the Missouri Penitentiary. So I go to the Missouri Penitentiary records, and there's the husband, but the wife is not there. So I want to know why the wife is not there. Missouri in 1853 had no facilities to imprison women. So she was released immediately, and he was released later on the promise that they would leave the state. Months later, I'm going through Boston records, and who should go through the Boston Fugitive Aid Society records? These two people going home on their way to Maine. So you can take, part of it is serendipity, part of it is luck, but you can take all of this and do a story that tells us something about the main protagonists in the story and what it is they were trying to do.
Well, and you also organized the book in a way that, I mean, there are three large chapters to start the book, which is Fugitive Slave Act, well, the resistance to Fugitive Slave Act, the whole compromise and colonization story, and then Richard goes state by state, or region by region. You got Missouri, Illinois, you got Kentucky, Indiana, you got Ohio, and bears down on those regions through the local press, story after story after story. Now, do you need to know all those stories to understand this? Maybe not, but somebody...
But you're going to get them.
Well, only from you. But somebody ought to do it, and did. Anyway, it really is the great achievement of this book that there's so stories about real people who get named here, who are utterly unknown. You've actually rescued so many. Well, you didn't rescue fugitive slaves, but you rescued their stories. Anyway.
But years ago, I was asked to do a reassessment of the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
And it dawned on me that our vision of the Underground Railroad is those good-hearted people who shelter folk once they get to the Free State. And there have been some work done that says, no, it's much more complicated than that. But what struck me as being unique is that what was going on at the point of departure. What is happening in those little places in Talbot County or Dorchester County in Maryland?
Right.
Who are these people that are running away, and who are the people who are aiding them to run away? Right. So I find out slaves are aiding other slaves to run away but deciding to stay. And the question is, why would somebody do that? Free blacks are aiding them to run away, and all the time are under enormous pressure from others to be expelled from Maryland. And there are local whites who are aiding them. And then on top of all of this, and this is what drove the pro-slavery people nuts, there were people coming from the north into the south, as they used to say, to entice people to run away.
Abolition emissaries.
And those were blacks and whites. So it takes a certain, for any of you who have used William Still's encyclopedic...
In fact, well, Bianca was in my office today talking about that very source.
Yes, the Underground Railroad. The first coverage in that book has nothing to do with a fugitive slave. It has to do with a white guy who goes south to help Still's brother's family escape and dies in the process, and is killed in the process. And I've always wondered why Still decided to open this incredible compendium on fugitive slaves with a story of somebody who wasn't a fugitive slave. So the question for me is, who are these crazies? And the way you find those crazies is by going into local court records. And all the circuit court records are there, but you have to find them. And those circuit court records are voluminous and they are detailed, and they tell you, give you all the blow-by-blow coverage of what is happening. So you find an event, you see if you could go past what that local source tells you into greater things, and then you go into the court records and you go into penitentiary records. Penitentiary records are wonderful things because they are detailed. They tell you the person's name, where they were born, his height, whatever defects he has or she has, and it goes into incredible detail about it. So you can paint pictures of people verbally with the information that you get out of these sources, but it takes time.
It takes time and a lot of months and weeks and years in archives and places.
But this is a bourgeois. This is a bourgeois profession, as you know. So we have time.
Well, for guys who have the Andrew Jackson Chair of American History, I mean, with big research accounts. But anyway.
And Jackson was good for something, for God's sake.
You notice how I didn't embarrass you this time by saying you were the
Andrew Jackson's American. Yes.
Anyway, a couple other things I want to get you to say something about, and then we'll open this up. There's so much here. We didn't even stop on the fact that colonization, removal, separation, emigration became such a crazy, complex question in the 1850s that, of course, there were black colonization who saw removal, leaving as their only option. And that never goes away. I mean, it comes back in the late 1850s. It's always there. But I wanted you to say something about, and this is not a widely known part of this history. Part of this context, by the 1850s especially, is that these northerns, because of the fugitive slave crisis, and because of this idea that the free black can never somehow fit in to the narrative they believe they're living, they start passing exclusion laws, sometimes called black laws. In Ohio, they were called black laws. In Indiana, exclusion laws, and so on. In many Midwestern, especially northern.
In the Constitution of Ohio, of
Indiana.
Constitution
of Indiana. Talk a bit about that, because what in effect is evolving out of this fugitive slave crisis and the crisis over free blacks is an attempt at an apartheid.
Yeah.
Before we would ever use that term. But that it really is the first American apartheid.
Well, I don't know if it's an apartheid in that sense, because an apartheid system presupposes that people are staying.
Well, that's true.
They're
that's
there.
true.
It's getting you are getting rid of the people.
Yeah. Except there are a lot of black laws that were trying to legislate the life of blacks as well. So anyway, go ahead.
But the idea is to persuade blacks that their life chances are better outside of the United States. All the while hearing blacks say, no, we are here, we were born here, we fought with you here, not in the first war, in the second war, we've always been here. This is ours as much as it is yours. It is sure as hell much more ours than those people who are coming off the boat and flocking into to cities, particularly in the eastern coast. So there's a tension and a conflict between people who say you don't belong, and it is in your best interest to leave. I always get suspicious when people tell me what's in my best interest. That is in your best interest to leave, and those who are saying, no, it is not. This is mine, it is yours. But after years and years of being squeezed by this insanity, there are some people who say, damn it, why am I staying here and bothering with this? Now, even Douglass would not be opposed to those people who says, as individuals says, I'm out of here. Right. America holds nothing for me, I'm going somewhere else, my future somewhere. There's a character, let me see if I could find him.
Who?
A man called, I found it, Charles Williamson. In a colonization meeting in Maryland in 1852, He's an old man. He's 68 by this time. And he gets up, and this is a colonization meeting, who is saying, we should go to Liberia. We want to go to Liberia. I said the highlight of the speech, the highlight of the proceeding was a speech by the elderly Charles Williamson, who over the years, it seemed, had tested the prospects of all possible sites of emigration. He had lived in Canada, Trinidad, and Haiti. And he reported to the audience, but none of them seem to have fulfilled my expectations. Now I am ready at this advanced age of 67 to try Liberia. Now, either this guy is a wandering soul, or there's something about America that drags him back but is never fulfilling. Yeah? That it always falls short of its promise. So there were, particularly in these hard political times of the 1850s, a growing movement of blacks to leave.
And especially after Dred Scott.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and
in the late 1850s was a big revival of.
And even Douglass had a ticket, right?
He had a ticket to go visit Haiti with his daughter in April of 1861. And the morning after the firing on Fort Sumter, he wrote a little column in the paper that said, "Trip to Haiti.
Postponed."
But
people,
he was going.
Yes, I mean, there was a sense of deep despair, and these are not people. There's what's Powell's first name?
William Powell.
William Powell.
Yeah.
Who, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, says to a meeting in New York City, I am going to, and if this is reminiscent, he's moving his family to England. I'm going to a country where my character and not the color of my skin would determine my children's future.
Nothing new under the sun. That had been used many times.
And he remains there until the firing of Fort Sumter.
Yeah.
And then he comes back. All his children are educated. One is a doctor. I mean, he lived a decade in Liverpool. But it was that sense of despair and giving up on America until America looked as though it might be getting its act together in a kind of bizarre way in the midst of a war.
Douglass was stunned and would get frankly depressed when he'd be out on the circuit, say in Ohio, early 50s. He was always out on the circuit. But when he ran into these black laws, it was like, I mean, it's hard enough to even imagine you can convince this country to ever end slavery. But then this legislature keeps passing these exclusion laws and black laws and so on. And it would cause him despair at times. The last thing I was going to ask Richard, I'm going to kind of let one of you ask, but I did want to get us to Fort Sumter, or to secession, because the fugitive slave issue is all over the secession crisis, too. It's so much of what all those attempted compromise are about, that nothing works. And I think you do a nice job of that, but we forget that there were so many different compromise measures bandied about in Congress and in the press during the secession winter of 1860-61, but so many of them had to do with the demand by the South enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. It was non-negotiable for them, which leaves you, to enter this book, it leaves you wondering,
But I wonder if
could the Civil War have ever been prevented?
I have always wondered if that was just a shrewd political move on their part, because they knew it wasn't going to happen.
No, they knew it hadn't been happening.
Yeah, they knew that the law wasn't being enforced in the way that it was meant to be enforced. Right. You can't have a law, an effective law, governing a community in which that community does not accept its basic principles. Right. It can't work. Right. And this is what people were arguing way back in 1850 when they were raising these prospects of this new law. So the people in 1861 knew all along that this law was not didn't have the community-based support that it could have in order to be effective. And more importantly, they realized that it was next to impossible. Look, the Southerners were not stupid. All they had to do is look at the record of returns to know that it was in their favor.
What's your total? That you have a number in here.
Yes, something like 300 and something that came up. It's not a vast
thousands of fugitives.
Yeah, yes. But the point is, yes, the point is they knew that any time a fugitive slave case came to a commissioner, in 98% of the time, the person is going to be returned. The problem is, only so few came before the commissioner.
Right.
Because people couldn't get their hands
on them.
They
weren't captured.
And in addition, many northern states are passing what we call personal liberty laws.
Right, right. Yeah, we're gonna get into that.
Which says you can't hold people in prison, as Pennsylvania's was.
There were some states that said, well, you can capture a fugitive slave, but you cannot use our prisons to hold them.
And Vermont said, if you capture a fugitive, you can come and capture the fugitive slave, but he must have a jury trial. So there are those things. So that James Mason, the originator, the proponent of the law, at one point despaired because he said it costs more to recapture a fugitive slave than the value of the slave himself. Because of so many impediments that were put in the way of doing it. And that is, of course, not assuming you might lose your life trying to. Old Gorsuch still is there hanging over all of this because the slaves killed him.
Okay, questions for Richard? Yes, Nathaniel.
So I'm curious about the role of jury trial in all this. You briefly mentioned it in Vermont requiring jury trial, but it seems like, so for instance, I remember how often were people bringing charges against people for resisting?
That is outside, yes.
Law, and then how often did juries convict them?
The commissioners are hearings, they are not jury trials. The jury trials that were held, I haven't found one in which there was a conviction. They ran out the clock with appeals in many instances. So people were convicted, but they were never sent. I think only one person that I think of in Massachusetts, for instance, actually went to prison. But the majority, in the vast majority of the cases, they ran the clock out on appeals. So that didn't work. But then that in effect is outside the purview of the law itself. That is something that states are doing in order to enforce, as their obligation to enforce the law, because those people have broken local laws, is how it's sealed. But it never works. It never works. Even in a case of murder, one of the policemen during one case in Massachusetts, in Boston, is shot and killed. He dies in the police station, and the perpetrators are never imprisoned or convicted. So they ran the clock out. Yes,
Steve.
As the decade progressed, was there a change in the nature, number of the prosecutions in order to attempt to return slaves, and also was there a difference between the eastern states and the more western states as to how they handled the fugitive slave catchers?
The fugitive slave catchers. There is, not surprisingly, the greatest number in the first 18 months after the passage of the law, as the law is being worked out. Its application, its enforcement is being worked out. So you get a large number, but to a significant extent, not surprisingly, in the large cities, the eastern cities are the places where you'd have the largest number of fugitive slave hearings Philadelphia, New York, Boston less so. But all of these become major political events, and this is why they seem so critical. And in the case of Harrisburg, for instance, you have, as you say, McAllister has a 100% record in the first, between September 1850 and December 1851, everybody who comes before him is remanded. By the time he leaves for Kansas, after he's run out of town, there's not a single case in Harrisburg again, because A, they can't find anybody to replace him, and B, the community is saying no way, it's not going to happen.
West of that, and even in California, were there many prosecutions?
No, California is although California had its own fugitive slave law, it was a state law. It wasn't a federal law. So there isn't much happening out in California. And as they say, California is different. But in places like Missouri, yes, you have a lot. Kansas, no. They've got their own battles going on. So that's why I concentrated in the book in those upper South states that are but free states, because that's where you'd have the greatest activity.
Yeah. It's interesting, you make us think about the fugitive slave law as one of the most unenforceable, unsuccessful laws we've ever seen, and yet a law that caused as much political turmoil as almost any law you could name in the 19th
But
century.
Interestingly, in the debate over the fugitive slave law, it is that great American political figure, Jefferson Davis, who argued that you cannot have a law about which the communities are not supportive, if that law is to apply to that community. I mean, he said it. He said he doesn't support this law, not
Did he
because
not vote for it?
No, well, I don't.
No, maybe he wasn't in the Senate then.
Oh, he was.
He wasn't.
He was in the Senate, but I don't know. I can't recall, but I know he was opposed to it. Mm-hmm. He was opposed to it on grounds of states' rights. It was federal intrusion into state rights. But he was absolutely clear that you can't. This is a joke. It's not going to happen.
But like other people in modern times, slaveholders were perfectly willing to use federal power to against the states to enforce certain things, but not others. Who's next? Other questions? Yes.
Just one question and one point. You talk a lot about many cases in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about how that clashed with Philadelphia being such an abolitionist town and the colonization society activity both being there? Was there lots of clashes with all that? Things were happening?
Well, it shouldn't surprise you that Philadelphia is the center of this activity, just given its geographical location to Maryland and Virginia. And the point is, Philadelphia provided a kind of anonymity for fugitive slaves that no other place could because of its sheer size of the black population. Right? Yeah, so people just, there's one case of a Virginia slaveholder looking for a needle in a haystack. He said, I go to every place that I know because this fugitive slave was writing letters home. You understand? And that is the other point that struck me as one of those great discoveries, that people communicated. You know, we've heard all this stuff about Bush telegraph and how these guys were writing letters. I mean, Henry Banks wrote a letter to his slaveholder the day after he escaped. And he wrote it to throw him off his track. He said, here's where I'm going. I'm going to Buffalo. And then 2 weeks or 2 months later, the slaveholder wasn't fooled. He said, I know where he's going. He's going to Philadelphia. So he sends people to Philadelphia and he can't find Banks. Banks writes another letter, and he has it post-dated Allegheny City, which is just outside, next door to Pittsburgh. So the people just said, "But what the hell is he doing in Allegheny City?" He writes, he says, I'm here on my way to California." So the slaveholder sends people to Western Pennsylvania because the slaveholder wasn't stupid. There was a community of free blacks who came, that were settled in Washington County in Pennsylvania, who had formerly been enslaved in this part of Virginia from which Banks escaped. So it was a reasonable conclusion to say he's going to find people. And then he got a third letter saying, "I'm in Hamilton, Canada. Hi."
And Banks ended up in that North Side View of Slavery book, the collection of...
No, that's a different Banks.
That's a different Banks?
Yes, I thought it was the same Banks, and I went, "Whoa, I've got my man," and then I realized it's different. Yeah, yes.
If there's anything positive out of this, I think it's community involvement. To see how communities actually did come together against tremendous odds. I think that's kind of, to me, that was like surprising to find out so much of this is community involvement.
Yeah.
That keeps these things, like you can come here, but you can't do this.
Yes. Yeah.
Just to say,
the black community is in many places made their views known very early on, and it was sustained, and they were helped enormously by white supporters, particularly groups of lawyers who did much of this pro bono, who turned up of hearings, although they were not supposed to be in the hearings. They demanded that they be represented, these slaves, these accused fugitive slaves, and the commissioners were thrown for a loop, because if somebody comes into your hearing and says, "I am representing these people," so in many instances they forced the hearing into something that approximated a court case. They didn't always win, but they kept pushing. And if you go to whatever city you are, you say it's the same group of people who are doing it. And they are old abolitionists, they're young abolitionists, but they are persistent. And they also involve, like somebody like Jim Miller McKinn in Philadelphia, he's involved also and he's part of the Vigilance Committee as well. So while he is protecting captured slaves, he's also helping to spirit away. And he's the only member of the acting committee, the only white member of the acting committee of the Vigilance Committee. So yes, and so you have these efforts that are in many instances in the book, although I never step back and say it, because there are certain things that I think that you should not beat people over the head with. Did I just end the sentence with a preposition?
Yeah.
Oh boy, my grandmother just called me.
All allow it once.
Yes, you shouldn't have to beat people over the head, but it is clear that this is a interracial organization, even in many cases when it isn't officially organized. And that's a different kind.
In reading your book, Rich, just to comment on that quickly, you think you know something about this, but this was law breaking. This was community, collective, and individual law breaking. I mean, which
didn't Jeff Sessions go out to California and say that?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Every time I hear him, I go, "Oh, Jeff, you don't know half of it."
And by the way, a major theme in Uncle Tom's Cabin is law breaking. 1852, the famous book. I mean, whatever else one thinks of it, it's a thread throughout the book. There are laws here that have to be broken, and the book is written as a response to the Fugitive Slave Act. I mean, there wouldn't be Uncle Tom's Cabin without the Fugitive Slave Act.
But didn't the congressman...
Wouldn't be Benito Sereno without the Fugitive Slave Act. Some say. I don't know. Some say.
Didn't the congressman who...
That's Melville.
Who voted for the law, but yet helped the fugitive slaves to escape?
Yeah.
It's right there.
That's the case she makes. And there were prominent eventually Republican politicians who, Salmon Chase, William Seward, Benjamin Wade, they defended fugitive slaves as part of their legal careers.
But before that, they were Free Democrats, which I think is a wonderful name. These are Free Democrats. They held a meeting.
That's what we need today.
They
A
held-
free Democrat.
They held a meeting. One of the great meetings is the one that takes place in Chicago weeks after the law was passed. Now, Chicago is Douglas with one S, is old Stephen Douglas bailiwick. And the city council passed a law supporting resistance to the law. Old Stephen ran back to Chicago to force them to change their view. But the point is, there were people who were saying, no, this is not right. It can't happen. But those people, and when you look at the list of members of the city council, you see they're all Democrats, and you say, how could Democrats do this? And then you realize that they all had the word free in front of it. So these were people who were not real Democrats.
Sure.
So I was wondering if you could talk about footnote 24 on page 152.
Is this one of those exegesis? I mean, you
It's where,
Say that again. What, footnote what? And
Footnote 24, page 152. It's where you're arguing with Stephen Kahn about the idea of free black communities
being maroon.
being like
Maroon communities.
oh, there you go.
I'm thinking of a community on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, in Wacomico County, mentioned in various settings, called San Domingo. Pretty extensive free black community that was established as early as 1805, 1810. And what descendants who are still in the community today still say is that it was named that
Yeah.
as a defense mechanism,
Mhm.
to basically say, we will fight you.
Yeah.
You know, we will keep you out of this area. That sounds a lot like Maranatha.
I think that is true for free black communities or black communities in the Upper South than it is in urban areas. Although it is, this is not to disparage the defensive systems that they employed and the mechanisms that they use to keep slaveholders at bay. But the idea of a maroon community, as far as I'm concerned, assumes a number of things. It is established, it is geographically fixed, it has its own economy, it has a kind of relation. So there are some of those issues that I think make them look like maroon communities, but I don't think. And the last point that I think I want to make is that maroon communities in many parts of the Atlantic world became the arm of the state in enforcing slave laws. And that's the bit that bothers me. Because I don't think that there's any example of any black community that I could think of in the 1850s that came to the aid of the state in enforcing the fugitive slave law. Yeah? The Maroons in Jamaica were notorious for helping after 1738 for aiding the state.
You know, the late great Ira Berlin, dear Ira,
Yeah.
he pushed this maroon idea for free black communities too. It's been around
Yeah.
quite a while, so it needed a corrective. Good work. Yes, sir.
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking of a lot of contradiction. I'm not amazed by the last one about the Maroons helping the state, because everybody is trying to survive. It's all about, people are looking out for their own interests in a very, very challenging situation. I don't think it's an ideological thing as much as it is a mean of survival. Because you imagine if suddenly the slave owners realized that those Maroon communities were there mostly helping slaves, there would have been more attacks on them. But I'm thinking there are so many contradictions in the United States throughout history as a state, as a group of people, where people go to the extreme to fight injustice and then still keep it. And I'm wondering if you have any kind of suggestion about an explanation for what's going on, like the last one about the congressman voting for the law and then not.
No, but that was a novelist's interpretation. She was bending the rules. No. I don't think that person wasn't real that we know of. No, but one of the things that you learn in doing this looking at these issues in antebellum America and afterwards is you do so much as you can to resist the system. I mean, you can't let it run roughshod over you. But the deck is stacked. So you could do like those people who then in the 1850s says, I leave the country. I sever ties with America because America is a waste of time. It offers me nothing. And I leave. Or you decide to stay and try to push back against the oppression, which is overwhelming. This is a minority population in a racist society, and those are the two great issues involved here. You could again, my old mentor C.L.R. James used to say, "Do you want piece of the pie or do you want to mash it up?" And if you want to mash it up, there's a price that you pay, and you run the risk of genocide. And there's ample evidence in the 19th century for people who are resisting this law to go all the way is to run the risk of that kind of. Now, people who resist the law in present-day America, for instance, the nonsense that's going on at the border, they're not facing genocides, they're facing expulsion. America has a long history of dealing with dissent in ways that are always unnerving to me if you go all the way. But resistance, my interest is how do oppressed people and their supporters fight against an oppressive system? What they do, knowing full well that the deck is stacked against them. Commissioners, police, the law, everything is stacked against you. Majority population, you're a minority. What do? You either cave or you resist. Or you do something in between. Some days you resist and some days you don't resist. So I think it's a very complex question. And it's not an easy question to answer. Yeah?
So along those lines, because I'm thinking about my own state where activists just pulled down Silent Sam.
Yay!
And,
that was just redecoration. It wasn't.
Yeah, but what happens often, and this is often the case, and you have to, so resistance is this. You just sort of have to shore up your own strength that you're just going to be in this fight for a while. I mean, it may be infinitely. It's just going to be a fight. But every time there is an effort at resistance like that, there is a doubling down by the state.
Yeah.
So how do you continue, and when the state doubles down with a gerrymandering law or with, arresting all the activists and putting Silent Sam back up, although I'm not exactly sure that's going to happen.
It's not, I don't, okay.
Yeah, I think Silent Sam's going
Or ICE asking for the voting records.
Yeah, every
right,
of
that's
all
right.
former
ICE
felons.
asking for the voting records in North Carolina. And the
So
Historic Commission the day after Silent Sam was brought down, the Historic Commission just said that they could keep the other 3 Confederate statues on the state capitol grounds.
Right.
So how...
Because there's a law they couldn't disobey, they say.
Right, there's a law they can't disobey that was passed only 2 or 3 years ago. Right. How do you continue to keep the strength? How did they continue to keep the strength when the law was doubling down on them?
But let me just say something in response to that. Memphis, Tennessee. There was a little cavalry officer in the Confederate forces.
A little one.
Called Nathan Bedford Forrest. Memphis, the city council, which is, I in agreement with, the city council, faced with these laws that you can't remove statues, sold the statue to a private citizen for $2, and then the person removed it. Now that is an act of resistance that comes up against the laws,
Just creative
and
thinking.
they find different ways of getting around it. So Silent Sam is not going to go up.
These will auction it off.
Yes, other statues may remain up, but somewhere else you're going to find another ingenious way devised to get around these restrictions on Confederate students. It's statues. It's going to happen. I can guarantee you it's going to happen, and they could do what the hell they want. It's not going to stop it.
Also, you know, we tell our students all the time, don't we, that I mean, it's our lessons in history, which we keep claiming there are. One is that every great change always has a reaction. Every revolution has a counter-revolution.
Where reaction.
Absolutely. It's like Newton's law. Although that doesn't help you out if you're living as a fugitive slave in a community where you're in danger, especially if you're near the border. And there's so much in this book, too, that shows how if you were living in a community near the Kentucky border or near the Maryland border after 1850 and even in the late 50s, you got to go north. You got to go further north. And people kept trying to. There's a reason 20 to 30,000 black folk moved into Canada in the 1850s. That's a lot of people. In fact, there were parts of Ontario, you show this, that were basically overwhelmed for a while. There were just too many people coming. It's called a refugee crisis. Yeah. But it's one of the age-old questions, isn't it? How do you sustain resistance when you're really up against impossible odds? How did any abolitionists even think slavery was going to end in their lifetime? And by the way, this whole dilemma that Richard just very eloquently described, it's the central dilemma of Frederick Douglass's life. How do you sustain any kind of hope in a system that utterly rejects you?
And a commitment to this thing called America, or a better America. You see, as a foreigner, as a person who teach American history, as a foreigner in America,
You're
people
subverting
say,
youth.
Richard, why did you come to America to teach history? I say, I came as a missionary. And it upsets people. But it is.
And he's taught in places like Pittsburgh, Houston, and Nashville. I mean, that's.
It is.
Those are interesting postings.
It is a real trying to understand what it is people are confronting as they attempt, as they say, look, there's no other country that is established that I can think of in the Western world, with the possibility of Haiti, that says, look, all men are created equal. What an incredible opening. That is the most revolutionary statement you could come up with. At the same time, you are building a slave society. So for the black American in the period after the revolution, is saying, hey guys, I'm not asking for very much. All I'm asking you is to live up to your vaunted principles. You trumpet this from the rooftops. This is America, and you still hear it now. It is an idea. America, and I hear people saying this, especially around this McCain funeral. America is an idea. I said, which idea? They're sitting next to that beautiful and wonderful principle of all men being equal is the recognition that it is built on the backs of a slave economy and a slave society. How do you square that? And how do you live with that? And I don't think after all these years I have an answer.
Douglass once said, America is its contradictions, all wrapped up in its contradictions. In other words, it is its contradictions. He took the idea, America's a freedom-loving place, America's this, America's that, and he said, no, it is its contradiction. Start there. Yes, Mecca.
Yeah, just in response to that, I want to say all men are created equal. That women as well,
Right.
What's your point?
My point is it just adds to it.
Yes.
Just say
Yeah, well,
all
sure.
men are created equal and that's the fundamental inequality. Black women don't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment.
Sure.
And that matters. That's a central part of the story.
Sure, you're absolutely correct. But my point, though, I know you will. You're just trying to bring me up, put me in my look. I thoroughly agree with you. But the point is, though, I am posing this tenet, this principle, with the actuality of what is going on the ground politically, and how do you live through the entire history of the place is a struggle to approximate something called equality. Yeah? Yeah, I think I see a hand back there.
Let's have one more.
Hi, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much. I was curious about your records. When you talk about court records, I do court interpreting historiography, and I find that at least before 1850, court records are incomplete. And so I was really curious to hear you say that you find very complete records. So I've gone to federal archives, for example, and I find them to be incomplete. So the Joint Commission had its own records? Are these in like the National Archives of the federal?
No, they're in the state. They're in the state. Yes, they're in the state capital, and they're all circuit court records.
These are state circuit.
Yes, these are state, but they're all there. What you have to do is just find out, and they're all wonderfully indexed. So you find out the name of the individual, and there it is. Yes, those records are there.
And even in county records, too.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, yeah. I mean, I've had to pair up records with newspapers.
Yes.
Where a lot of like minutes of the trial, just to call it that. That's what
Yeah,
they're
well,
associated.
the stenographers were very proud of their skills. So these trials are covered in great detail. These hearings are covered in great details, and the only problem that I found is that you have to balance the Whig coverage of the trial with the Democratic coverage of the trial, and later on Republican, and so you can't skip any paper and say, well, this paper covers it, because it's not always the same slant that they put on the thing. And then it means that you have to then impose your will on all of this stuff that you collected. I had, and Vanderbilt, I'm very grateful to Vanderbilt because it has a machine where I just press a button and the paper, it prints the page. And it's free.
They've had those for years.
Yeah.
But free? Not necessarily.
Free. And I just sat there, and so I have cabinets full of paper that I have to make sense of.
Yeah.
And my students pass and say, but Professor Blackett, isn't it digitized? And I say, go away. Because it's not digitized, and I don't even know how to do digitized stuff anyway. So, yeah, it's good. It's time for me to retire because I have to learn new stuff now. You know, I mean, I can't do that.
Yeah, we all have that dilemma. When I was at Amherst College some
40 years
ago, they completely remodeled the Robert Frost Library. They eliminated the entire microfilm and reading room and all of that, and turned it into, the video archive. And they were going to get rid of all of the microfilm readers. And we had a meeting with the library, and they said, but that's a dying technology. And some of us stood up and said, well, we're going to die with it. And they saved about 2 readers down in the corner, for us old fogies, because they're things you have. Well, anyway, you know that story. Well, it's daunting to do research the way Richard does it, but it is the way great books come about. And anyway, Richard, thank you for doing this. And I urge you all to get Captain's Quest for Freedom.